Okay, I realize we have not shared the agenda. I mean, we have shared it in advance, but I open it up quickly just that everyone knows where we are in the agenda. So next one up in the first half of this workshop, where we try to present what we have done in the mHealth Hub from different angles, also based on priorities Zelenek and his colleagues have mentioned during the last 1 and 2 years. So trying to really focus on what your support needs were. One of the things you mentioned, Zelenek, and your colleagues as well, were, and that of course relates to aspects of integration of mHealth applications into existing processes and systems. So one of the things you have mentioned often is getting some advice or recommendations in relation to ethical and regulatory aspects and around mHealth applications. And I'm happy that we have Petra Wilson with us today, one of the experts in this area, I think. So Petra, maybe you introduce yourself, that you can do much better than I can. Hello, Petra.
Hi, thank you very much, Sonia, and thank you to everybody for attending this meeting. As you can see on the agenda that we just looked at, we're a little bit behind time already, so I'm going to maybe try and speed up a little bit, but I will go through what was intended, but I'll try and make up a little bit of the lost time. So as Sonia said, I'm going to be talking about the ethics framework, and if I could ask you to share the slides, then I'll ask you to move through them as we go. Is that okay? Yeah, or am I sharing the slides myself?
Yeah, I mean, that's what we said. If we can, of course, share it. No worries, but I would need to...
I'm sorry, I thought you were sharing them. Okay,
I can do it as well, Petra, no worries.
Okay, well, then while you get them up, I'll just quickly introduce myself. So my name is Petra Wilson. I'm in this project through the Personal Connected Health Alliance, which is a sub-part of HIMSS, the Health Information Management and Systems Society. That's a trade group that brings together both industry and government partners in trying to help member states of the European Union, but also much wider than that, in making the most of the possibilities of digital health, e-health, in taking us to the next level. Within this project, what my group have done has looked particularly at the legal and ethical challenges, and that's because from my background, I'm a public health lawyer by training, and my focus has been very significantly on the application of the GDPR and now the application of the incoming Digital Governance Act, Data Governance Act, in the realm of e-health and mHealth. And that's partly of what I'm going to dive into today. So what I'm going to do today falls into two parts. I'm going to begin by walking you through the ethics quick guide that we developed within the mHealth Hub, which we hope is going to be very useful to you in orientating yourselves in terms of ethical issues. And then I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the issues around the GDPR. And I note that in the presentation that we just had, most of the mHealth solutions that you're running in the Czech Republic now are not yet processing sensitive personal data on the public platforms. However, you are moving in that direction. So obviously it's important to be GDPR compliant. I'm sure you are already, and I'm sure it's high on your agenda. Sonia, if you could put up the next slide, and I'm actually going to spend a long time on this slide. I'm not going to, you don't need to rush to try and read it all now, because I'm going to spend quite a long time talking about this slide, and this is the only slide that I'm going to put up on the ethical issues. So let me try and walk you through this a little bit. We developed this because we recognize that ethics is a really difficult concept when it comes to mHealth. there is an almost automatic reaction that people think that we have to be careful about ethics in mHealth, and that we have to find ways of making mHealth ethically acceptable. But as soon as we start digging into that, we find that there is a huge amount of information, loads of different guidelines, recommendations, standards, and I don't mean technical standards, I mean more ethical guidance standards. And you can very quickly become overwhelmed by the types of information that there are. So what we tried to do is develop something that we called a quick guide, and the idea is really that we try and bring together a wealth of information and help a user orientate themselves in that information. What I want to make very clear here is that this is one perspective. There are other ways of cutting the ethics cake. It doesn't always have to fall into these 4 slices or categories. But this is one way of looking at it. So if you go onto the hub, what you will find is you will find this, and under each of the headings that you see in the 4 boxes, you will find a little bit more information. And sitting behind that as well, you will find what we've called the annotated bibliography, which is a series of source documents, a lot of them from academic journals, which give background to these 4 ethical principles. So how did we end up with these 4 ethical principles? Well, for any of you who have worked in this area before, they may look a little bit familiar. They come from the sort of standardized biomedical ethical principles developed by Beecham's and Childress in the 1980s. And those 4 ethical principles in the Beecham and Childress principles have become the groundwork of bioethical principles, and we felt that they were the best way to orientate ourselves in mHealth as well. So what I want to do now is walk through those 4 principles. And I'm going to start with transparency. When we develop mHealth tools, it is of paramount importance that we are as transparent as possible about what they are. And we've further broken transparency down into 3 big buckets. The first is transparency of purpose. And this means that you must be able to be clear to an end user, and that may be a citizen, it may be a patient, it may be a healthcare professional, about what the purpose is. Being clear about what the purpose is also means identifying the user target group and being able to engage with that user target group. Transparency of purpose is closely related to transparency of products and services. And here we see particularly issues about being clear about how a particular product or service is funded and how it's developed. The funding aspect is really, really important when we talk about mHealth solutions, because many mHealth solutions are free of charge as up to a certain level, and then include services which have to be paid for. There are some people who go down the line of saying if there are add-on buy-in services within an mHealth solution, that is ethically questionable. I think what we're trying to say here is it's not necessarily anything that is ethically wrong to allow a citizen or a patient to buy extra services, but it must be very clear that what they are doing is buying extra services, and particularly if the purchase of those services is through sharing their data. We're very clear here that buying a service may not be a financial or traditional financial transaction, but it may be providing your data for reuse and thereby buying additional services. That also means that you have full transparency on any use of advertising and sponsorship, and that citizens can see upfront if there is any kind of sponsorship deal that they ought to be aware of in the provision of an mHealth service. And then relatively newer into the ethics debate around mHealth is the use of artificial intelligence, and trying to explain to an end user how artificial intelligence tools are used. This is a really big and complex issue. We don't necessarily know, it's not necessarily possible to explain a full artificial intelligence stack upfront, because that would be far too demanding. And if you did try to do that, you would lose the interest of the end users very quickly. The key thing here is to be as transparent as possible when, for example, a bot is developed on artificial intelligence, and to give some background as to what the training data sets were in developing that artificial intelligence tool. And then finally, it's important to be very transparent about the promise, being clear as to what the potential positive and negative outcomes of using the mHealth service are. I'm not going to go into massive detail on all of these, but that's just to give you the first ethical principle, which is transparency. Somewhat related to transparency, although they're all very much related, is the idea of agency. Agency is very closely related to autonomy. So agency means that the end user, whether that's a clinician or a patient or a citizen, remains in control as much as possible, that they can exercise their autonomy, and that they are agents of what they are doing within using the mHealth Hub. A particular challenge of agency in mHealth solutions is that balance between, on the one hand, being helpful and supportive to somebody who may have limited capacity, and on the other hand, allowing the patient or the end user to remain in control. And that's why at the bottom there, you will see the heading Respect for Vulnerability. One of the things that it's really important to think about in mHealth solutions is in how far they allow the end user to move between situations in which they are fully autonomous and fully in control, and situations in which they actually want to be vulnerable and want to have decision support and want to be guided through solutions and decisions. So agency is a particularly challenging issue in mHealth. The next one I want to speak about is accountability. Accountability is the one that is perhaps most closely linked to the legal principles. And accountability means that the end user, the patient or citizen or healthcare professional, knows, to put it very simply, who is to blame if something goes wrong, who is going to be responsible, who's going to pay the compensation, and to whom the end user can turn. On a very practical basis, this means making sure that an end user understands who they can turn to if they have a complaint or a problem. But it also means that behind that, we have to have a very high level of transparency around the accountability procedures and the standards that have been complied with. And I know that Petra Hogendahl, when she talks about the ISO standards, will talk quite a lot around some of these accountability concepts. But there is also an emerging issue around social accountability. That is things like the sustainability and the long-term availability of an app, but it's also about environmental issues, environmental sustainability in the service design, the so-called the green quotient of the app. And one of the big benefits of mHealth solutions and eHealth solutions generally is that they can contribute to the greening, the more environmental sustainability of healthcare systems. But we also need to be very upfront about that. So accountability and transparency are very closely related. And then the last ethical principle to talk about is equitable access. This is in many cases the most complicated one, because mHealth, almost by definition, is something that is accessible to those who have access to the infrastructure that can use it. So many mHealth apps are dependent on a smartphone. That means that it's difficult for individuals who don't have access to a smartphone to be able to use an mHealth solution. WHO has worked very hard to give guidance on how equitable access can be achieved with low-end simple applications using basic SMS type messaging rather than high-end smartphone applications. One of the things that is really important when a member state rolls out an mHealth solution is that they try to build in as much variation as possible to allow different levels of access, so for different levels of material capacity for end users. But material access is also, again, closely related to the concept of transparency, because we need to be able to tell people upfront what the costs are of using a particular mHealth solution and the costs that they may incur. Equitable access, however, isn't just about material issues. It isn't just about having the money to buy the smartphone or the broadband to run the service. It's also very significant about physical and intellectual access. A lot of mHealth applications are actually very hard to use for exactly the people they're targeted to. It may depend on quite complex interfaces. We may have a lot of issues around quite a lot of manual dexterity, being able to use small icons or small buttons. It's also really important to think about things like colors, fonts, volumes. Again, Petra will talk about this a little bit more, but it is important when either commissioning or rolling out an mHealth solution that those physical accessibility issues are high on the agenda. And then there is also the issue of intellectual accessibility. And that's all about taking account of different intellectual capacities and trying to understand where you're pitching a solution and perhaps allowing for different levels of literacy and capacity in developing and designing an mHealth solution. Now, I realize I'm already at time for my slot, so I'm going to stop here on the ethics part, and I'm going to then walk rather quickly through the GDPR part. But I hope that's given you an idea of what the mHealth quick ethics guide is about, and I hope you will find it useful. Just a quick flag up, what we're doing now adjacent to this piece of work is providing a bit of guidance, a little bit like the fiches that were demonstrated by Vanessa earlier on, to see how this would apply when you apply it to a specific service for diabetes. So what does this mean when you apply it to an M-diabetes solution? I'm going to pause there just for a second in case there's a specific question on that before I move on to the GDPR issues.
Yes, Petra, and just one sentence from me. No worries too much about time. I mean, we have 1 hour at the end for discussions, and if there are any wishes to discuss things now, please go ahead and do so, of course.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions on the ethics guide before I jump into talking about GDPR? So I'm going to move from a rather more general conceptual issue in ethics to digging more specifically into the law around GDPR and data use. No questions?
Maybe no question, but a comment, because incidentally, first, thank you for this nice and sophisticated, thoroughly designed elements of ethic guide in mHealth. But incidentally, activities related to ethics in digital health, which is very similar, just maybe with broader scope, is ongoing work in mHealth, in eHealth network in Europe. And I'm just thinking of two things. First, not to be overwhelmed with many various ethic guides, because then the value of this ethics guide is diminished a bit. And then, which is possibly more important, how to synchronize these activities. Because if I look at the guide you presented, it's very good, but it's different, slightly different. In some cases, even more than slightly different than what the guide is being developed in the eHealth network. So I am not able to interconnect you with the team working on that, but it's really ongoing activities this week and maybe the following weeks under French presidency. And that's interesting that the view on ethics can be different in various groups, but then in the end it should be very similar, but it's a question of there are many teams in Europe possibly working on similar stuff, and how to interconnect. So this is my comment. How to interconnect this, particularly when this new ethics for digital health is being developed by eHealth Network.
Thank you very much. And I have in the past worked with the eHealth Network. I don't think these issues are radically different to what's in the eHealth Network. I think what you sometimes have is the use of different words. And one particular example is, for example, do you use the word agency or autonomy? We chose to use the word agency here, but you can see in the breakdown that autonomy is within agency. I think the eHealth Network chooses to use the word autonomy more prominently. But one of the things that I this is the only thing I will really say about this. The reason it's called a quick guide and it's not a guideline and it's not a code is that it is my personal opinion that something which purports to be a top-down code is not appropriate, because there are too many variations, too many nuances that have to be adapted to a particular setting and to a particular end use, that what we need is orientation and guidelines rather than codes. And the very fact that for at least 10 years, developing an e-health code has been on the agenda and hasn't been achieved. And we have to recognize also that the GDPR itself calls for codes and none have been adopted yet, demonstrates that actually coming with a top-down code which says you must is not appropriate in this sector. And I do believe that the eHealth Network will also come round to the idea that what it's about is general guidance rather than top-down codified behavior. I hope that makes sense.
It's a very wise approach, very wise.
Thank you. I see that there's a question. I can't actually see who it's from on my screen.
Sorry, Petra, I check it out. I also can't see it because I'm sharing my screen.
Mark, you have a question?
Yeah, Mark and Zoe. First Mark and then Zoe. You can even see who raised the hand first. So, Mark.
Mark, you're on mute.
Yeah. Sorry if I'm passing just before you. Petra, I think it's a very interesting slide first, but also a very interesting discussion about codes and guidelines. My question is perhaps more practical. In your mind, with your own perception, how would you see at what moment in what process would you see applying this guide? Meaning, would you see it can be seen as a kind of checklist where we say when we develop a policy and develop a set of projects like those that Zdenek has mentioned, projects from the RRF, we can when developing a project we can say, okay, are we developing something that is likely to be ethics, and then we check and we check all these boxes to see whether there are principles. Is this the way you would see it, or do you see another way to apply this guide in this policy framework? How do you see that on your side?
Okay, so first of all, one of the things we also said, and in the background document of this, is it's not a checklist. It's not as simple as just saying, check, we know what transparency of purpose is. It goes a little bit deeper than this. If you were to think of it a bit more like a religion, these aren't 10 commandments that you can simply say tick. These are the spirit of the 10 commandments. It's all the way through. Are you transparent in your purpose. And that goes actually to your question of when do you use this? The way that we had foreseen this is that it's something that remains constant throughout a project, from design through implementation and through continuous assessment. So for example, if you take transparency of purpose, you want right from the beginning, when you're commissioning a tool, to be transparent as the commissioner about what you want it to do. And then you want that transparency to go all the way through so that the service that is offering it, so a healthcare service, knows what they're offering and why, and the end user, the patient, knows what's being offered and why, and that you have a sense check regularly that that transparency of purpose is being maintained throughout. So it is very much a continuous tool that's designed to go all the way through. I know that that makes it look very big, and what you've got here is one slide that purports to do everything. But that's why it's just an orientation tool. It's just a series of issues to have in your mind, and each of these boxes could have much more in it, but we chose to try and keep it to 2 or 3 key issues to get people started. So I would love to be able to tell you it's a one-off checklist. You do this and you're fine. You're ethically, you're in a good place ethically. Like all things ethical, it takes continuous work to achieve the result.
Thank you, Petra.
Thank you, Zoe.
Yeah, I just thought that the point raised about the EHN guidelines versus the mHealth Hub provided guidance, it's very valuable, and it merits to be clarified as much as possible. EHN guidelines are part of the open coordination method. It's very much member state driven. It's member state experts getting together, pulling together guidelines of where it is feasible and possible to be implemented in member states to increase trust between member states. They, as such, I think they would profit from mHealth Hub guidance, for example, the ethics guide. But also when a member state is implementing EHN guidelines, the mHealth Hub guidance can be supplementary. It should never, of course, contradict, and it will not, as Petra explained, but it's a different method of producing and arriving at these guidelines in the mHealth Hub through broad stakeholder involvement, consultation. And the EHN have a different objective. There will be several areas where the EHN will be producing and issuing guidelines. They have a more, let's say, formal, it's more like a formal requirement for member states to increase trust. The mHealth Hub is there to support implementation. So they work together, they do not contradict each other, and they cannot be substituted by each other.
Thank you for that clarification, Zoe. It's really good. And there's one thing I would like to really underline that you've just said. You said that the purpose of the guidelines for the eHealth network is to build trust. That, for me, if I were redesigning this, and if it weren't for the mHealth Hub, I would put the word trust in the middle of that circle, because for me, the entire purpose of having ethical guidelines is to build trust. And I think whilst you won't create trust simply by following these guidelines, if you were to follow these guidelines, you would take significant steps towards building trust in mHealth. So it maybe would be interesting to kind of put that up front, that the purpose of following ethical guidelines is to build trust and to maintain trust. Thank you. Shall I go ahead and walk very quickly through what we produced on GDPR? Yes?
Yes, I would say so. And then Raquel, you can maybe park your question for the discussion slot at the end. Because
Oh, I can otherwise take a quick question from Raquel because, yeah.
If it's quick, yes, we are. Yeah, okay. Raquel, a quick question.
Yeah, quick question because I have to leave very soon to another conference call. It just seems to me, Petra, that these principles, which are obviously great guidelines, are really applicable more broadly than mHealth to any form of really digital service. And I think we need to look at that because mHealth never stands by itself.
Yeah, I fully agree that there are tweaks in this which are particularly mHealth oriented because of the things like the access issues are more mHealth oriented than general eHealth. But the 4 principles, as I said at the beginning, equitable access, transparency, agency, accountability, they are drawn out of the Beecham's and Childress bioethical principles. So it goes, this comes from, and their work it draws on Aquinas. I mean, we're going back hundreds of years. This is not a modern answer. I don't want to keep referring to religious issues. It's not in any way like that. But these principles permeate so much. All we're trying to do here is give them a spin that is mHealth. But you're absolutely right. This is applicable across all sorts of areas of healthcare and eHealth. What I think is maybe interesting is that if you look at a principle like sort of agency, traditionally healthcare did not really respect agency. Healthcare was about doing to the patient in a respectful way, but doing to the patient. Where mHealth changes things is it brings the patient in far more as an agent of their own healthcare. So those are some of the nuances that change.
Okay, great.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm just going to take maybe 5 minutes to walk through the GDPR because, of course, two background points. The GDPR is a piece of law you all know. It's something that that does apply to you. But what I wanted to give you a quick note on is that we did produce a guidance to the GDPR, which is online if it's useful to you. So first thing here is to remind ourselves that what the GDPR says and its core principles, and they're clustered here together into 6 areas. And they are that if you're going to use data within an mHealth solution, so I'm going to orient everything to mHealth, you must do so lawfully. And I'm going to come back in a minute on the next slide to what lawfully means. It means that you have to collect data for a specified purpose. So you need to tell people what data you're collecting and why. You need to collect data that is adequate for what you're going to do, but is limited to that. So you can't collect data just in the hope that you can use at some point in the future. It's a crucial point for mHealth. You need to stick to what you actually need to provide that service. Data needs to be accurate and up to date. That means patients need to be able to check what data you have. You can keep it only as long as is necessary. That's a difficult concept because necessary, as we say in English, is as long as a piece of string, i.e. it's very hard to define. And the data that you keep must be kept securely and must be protected. So those are the basic principles of GDPR that you need to stick to. They require that you have a data controller, a person who is responsible. So that goes back to the accountability principle in our ethics principles. And we note that it applies to the data of natural and legal persons. Sorry, it applies to the data of natural persons, so people like you and I, but the processor could be a legal person, as in an entity. So the data must be about a real person, but the processor doesn't have to be a real person. It can be a legal entity. If we have the next slide, please. I said I was going to give you a quick guidance on what is what does lawfully mean. So on the next slide, we identify what is lawful. Next slide. Lawful means, no, I think we've missed a slide. If you go back one, no, one, next one, that one, perfect, thank you. So lawfully means that you comply with these principles. Now, if we're talking about lawful processing of health-related data, we have to choose one of the principles in the general legal basis under Article 6 and one of the principles applicable to sensitive information under Article 9. I'm not going to go through all of these here, but you see, for example, that you have to have something like consent or a legitimate interest for collecting data. And then if you are collecting sensitive data, which you will be if it's a health-related app, so an mHealth app, you also need to have another reason for doing it, and that might be explicit consent, or it might be something like the provision of healthcare services. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but what is really important to remember is that in mHealth we're talking about sensitive data, which means we have to have both the legal basis under Article 6 and the additional legal base under Article 9 fulfilled. The big challenge in mHealth is that under Article 9, these legal bases vary quite significantly country to country. And when we're trying to develop a solution or use a solution that has been licensed in another member state, the compliance with Article 9 can be complex. Thank you very much. If we move on to the next slide, it's really important to remember that the GDPR sets up a huge range of rights for the data subject, the person. So in an mHealth setting, that this is the patient or the citizen using the service. And what you see here is some of these rights also link back to the ethical principle. So the right to information about what data is being collected relates to the ethical principle of transparency. The right of access to data and rectification of data and erasure of certain data relates very strongly to the principle of agency. You, as a citizen, you have a right to be an agent in how your data is used. The data portability then relates to the ethical principles around equitable access, because you want somebody to be able to take their service from one service provider to another. So again, I'm not going to go into full detail here, but I hope with those little examples I've just shown you that our ethical guide is also a way of orientating yourself within the legal requirements. Because the legal requirements set out in the GDPR are based in the ethical requirements. And then for my last slide, please, on the GDPR, what I would want to just stress to you is that there are a number of requirements that the GDPR sets up for the data controllers who are likely to be the owners or the holders of the mHealth app. So the Ministry of Health or the healthcare provider who is providing the app is likely to be a data controller. The provider of the app itself might be the data processor. In some cases could still be the data controller, but very often in a healthcare setting, the data controller will be the end healthcare provider who is part of using the app. And they have to implement data protection policies, and those policies in turn will go back to some extent to the ethical principles. But really importantly, they need to implement data protection by design and by default. That means that they have to demonstrate that the mHealth app has data protection at its heart. That means that you have to implement security measures. Important element in implementing security measures, the biggest security risk in mHealth is not the app, it's the people who use it. And we really need to remember that security means HR training. That's the most important thing, is making sure that people understand the security risks of what they're doing when they're using an mHealth solution. You'd be astounded how often healthcare providers still use passwords like administrator or doctor or nurse. and then wonder why they have security breaches. And then finally, the GDPR is stringent in requiring record keeping about who has access data, when, why, and for what purpose. This is a really, really quick run through of what's in the GDPR, and there is more on the mHealth Hub. But as we've gone over time a little bit, I'll just stop in case there's specific questions on GDPR and then hand back to Sonia for the rest of the session.